When I opened my eyes, my daughter was crouched beside me on the trail, pressing something cold against my wrist, not helping me up, not calling out for anyone, just focused on my wrist, fingers working at something small. "What are you doing?" My voice came out wrong, thin, scraped raw. She pulled back fast. Her face shifted into something soft and worried, but I had already seen the other expression, the one she wore before she knew I was watching. "Dad, you passed out. I was checking your pulse." I looked down at my wrist. My watch was gone. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense without the beginning, and the beginning, I'm ashamed to say, was me being a fool. My name is not important. What matters is this: I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years teaching economics at the University of British Columbia. I have read contracts, spotted manipulation in data sets, counseled students who were being taken advantage of by landlords, by employers, by people who smiled while they lied. I am not a naive man. And yet, my wife, Sandra, died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. That's how fast it moves. We had been married 37 years, and I won't pretend those years were always easy, but she was the person I talked to every evening, the person who knew which coffee mug was mine, who remembered that I hated cilantro and loved those terrible butter tarts from the bakery on Granville Island. When she was gone, the house didn't feel empty so much as it felt wrong, like a sentence with a word missing that you can't stop noticing. My daughter, Renee, stepped in immediately. She was attentive in those first weeks, calling every morning, bringing food, sitting with me through the evenings I couldn't manage alone. I was grateful. She is my only child, and grief does strange things to perspective. It makes you see what you want to see. What I didn't see, not then, was Renee's husband, Dwight. Dwight is a financial advisor. He manages other people's money for a living, which means he has spent his career studying exactly how much people can be separated from what they have before they notice. He is very good at seeming helpful. He asks questions in a particular way, not demanding, just curious, and by the time the conversation is over, you've handed him information you didn't plan to share. He started coming along on the visits after the first month. Renee would make tea and Dwight would sit across from me at the kitchen table and ask how I was managing the house, the retirement accounts, the RRSP, the TFSA, whether I'd thought about simplifying things, whether having so many accounts at different institutions was really the most efficient arrangement. I told him I had a financial advisor of my own, a man named Bertrand, whom I'd worked with for 12 years, who had my mother's phone number in case something happened to me, and who sent me a birthday card every October. Dwight nodded and said that sounded great, just great, and then 2 weeks later he was back with the same questions phrased slightly differently. I should have recognized it then. I didn't. What I noticed instead was how tired I was getting. It started gradually, the way these things do. A heaviness in the mornings that coffee didn't fix. A fog that settled over my thinking around noon and didn't lift. I'd been sleeping poorly since Sandra died, so I told myself that was the explanation. Grief is exhausting. Everyone says so. Renee brought me a sleep supplement. A natural one, she said. No prescription needed, just something to help my body regulate. She'd read about it online. It was in a plain white bottle with a simple label, and she put it on my nightstand and told me to take 1 capsule before bed. I thanked her. Then she brought a candle. For the bedroom, lavender, she said, which was supposed to help with sleep and anxiety. She'd been burning one herself for years. She set it on my dresser and showed me how far to burn it down before I blew it out. A month later, she brought an air diffuser. For the living room, she filled it herself and said she'd ordered a refill that would be delivered automatically. I was taking the supplement. I was burning the candle most evenings. The diffuser ran in the background while I read or watched television. The fog got worse. By October, about 8 months after Sandra died, I was having trouble finishing sentences in my own head. I'd stand in the kitchen and forget why I'd walked in. I drove to the grocery store and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes because I couldn't remember if I'd already been inside or was about to go. I was 62 years old and I thought I might be losing my mind. I mentioned it to my doctor at my annual checkup. She ran blood work and told me my iron was slightly low and that grief could have cognitive effects that sometimes mimicked early dementia, and that I should try to get more sunlight and maintain a routine. She seemed satisfied with that answer. I was not. I mentioned it to Renee. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine and said, "Dad, I've been worried about you for months. This is exactly what I've been telling Dwight. You need support. You shouldn't be alone in that house." That was the first time she mentioned moving. Not moving me into care, she said. Just downsizing. The house was too big for one person. All those stairs, the maintenance. Sandra and I had bought it in 1991 when prices were different, and by now it was worth considerably more than we'd paid, and wasn't it sensible to simplify, to free up that capital, to move somewhere that didn't require so much upkeep? She had a condo in mind, she said, a nice building in Burnaby, 1 bedroom, concierge, easy parking. She'd even talked to someone about pricing. I said I'd think about it. 3 weeks later, she brought a pamphlet. My friend Hugh had been calling for months, and I kept finding reasons not to answer. We'd taught in the same faculty for 15 years. He retired 2 years before me and spent his summers hiking trails in the Kootenays and his winters annoying his adult sons with opinions about their cooking. He is one of the most persistently cheerful people I have ever met, and at that point I did not feel capable of cheerful. He stopped by the house one Wednesday without calling first. I opened the door, and he looked at me for a moment before he said anything. "You looked like hell." "Thank you, Hugh." "I'm serious. You look gray. How long have you been gray?" I told him I'd been having trouble sleeping. He came inside and I made coffee, and we sat in the kitchen, and somewhere in the middle of talking about nothing important, I realized it was the first time in weeks I'd been able to follow a conversation without losing the thread. Something about being with someone who expected nothing from me, no decisions, no forms, no signatures, made the fog lift slightly. Hugh noticed. He's observant in the way that people who spend decades in classrooms become observant. "Are you on any new medication?" he asked. "Just a sleep supplement. Renee brought it." He asked to see it. I got the bottle from the nightstand and handed it to him. He turned it over several times, read the label, then set it on the table between us. "This brand is not Canadian," he said. I looked at it again. He was right. The website listed on the label was American, and the address, when we looked it up, was a mail forwarding service in Nevada. "The candle," I said suddenly, "and the diffuser." We went through the living room and the bedroom. Hugh photographed everything on his phone. He didn't say much, but he had a particular expression I recognized from faculty meetings, the one he wore when he'd spotted something in an argument that didn't hold up. When he left, he told me not to touch anything until he'd made some calls. I didn't stop using the candle or the diffuser that night. Looking back, I don't know why. Part of it was that I told myself Hugh was being dramatic. Part of it, I think, was that I wasn't ready to accept what his concern implied. Because if the supplement and the candle and the diffuser were wrong, then Renee had brought them to me. And Renee was my daughter. Instead, I started paying attention. I noticed that Dwight's questions about my finances had escalated in a direction I hadn't tracked carefully enough. He'd moved from general questions about accounts to specific questions about my power of attorney, whether I had one, whether it was up to date, whether I'd considered whether the person named in it was still the right choice. Sandra's sister Maureen was named, but she was elderly now, he said. Wasn't it worth revisiting? I noticed that Renee had been accompanying me to 2 of my last 3 medical appointments. She spoke on my behalf at one of them, summarizing my symptoms, offering the sleep troubles and the cognitive fog as context, and I had let her because I was genuinely struggling to track the conversation myself. I noticed that Renee and Dwight had been copying each other on emails they sent me about the house, the condo, the finances. A small thing, perhaps, but it meant there was a paper trail between them that didn't include me. And I noticed that when I mentioned, casually, that I'd been thinking about calling Bertrand to review my portfolio, Renee's expression flickered before she smiled and said that was a great idea, of course, though she'd heard from someone that Bertrand's firm had been having some difficulties lately. Nothing specific, just something she'd heard. Bertrand's firm was perfectly fine. I called him the next morning and he said so himself, and we talked for 40 minutes, and by the end of it he had flagged 3 things: that I had not reviewed my estate documents since before Sandra's illness, that my power of attorney needed updating, and that he'd noticed Renee's name had been added as a secondary contact to one of my accounts, something he had no record of me authorizing. I hadn't authorized it. I stopped using the supplement that night. I put the diffuser in the garage. I didn't tell Renee. Within 2 weeks, the fog began to lift, not all at once, more like a window being cleaned in sections, areas of clarity appearing where there had only been smear. I made an appointment with a different doctor, one I found through a colleague at the university, and I brought the supplement bottle and a sample of the diffuser liquid, which I'd collected in a small container. I told him what I suspected. He looked at me with the kind of seriousness that makes your stomach drop, and he said he'd send everything to a lab and we'd have answers within 10 days. I did not tell Renee about this appointment. What I did do was accept her invitation to go hiking. She'd suggested it 2 weeks earlier, a trail in Lynn Canyon, not too difficult, a chance to get outside and clear my head. She seemed pleased that I'd agreed. We planned it for a Saturday in November, one of those cold, bright Vancouver days where the mountains look painted against the sky. We were 40 minutes into the hike when I started to feel wrong, a heaviness in my chest that I hadn't had since stopping the supplement and a faint buzzing at the edges of my vision. I slowed down. Renee walked ahead on the narrow trail and didn't notice. I sat down on a fallen log to wait for it to pass. It didn't pass. The last thing I remember is the bark of the log under my palms and the sound of the creek below the trail, very clear, the way sounds get when everything else quiets down. When I woke up, a woman I didn't know was crouching beside me. She had gray hair pulled back and a dog on a leash, and she was pressing her fingers against my wrist, not checking my pulse, checking my watch. A fitness tracker Renee had given me 2 months earlier, one with a health monitoring feature that, Renee had explained, would send alerts if my heart rate spiked or dropped. The woman looked up at me. She said, "Your daughter went to call for help. She's just down the trail." I looked at my wrist. She had the watch unfastened and was holding it in her palm, not pressing it to my skin, holding it away from me. "Why do you have that?" I asked. She hesitated for a moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry to alarm you. My name is Petra. I'm a pharmacist. I retired last year, but some habits stay." She held the watch toward me so I could see the face. "This device has a passive transdermal feature that I've seen before. It's not common, but I've seen it. It delivers compounds through the skin. It's been used legitimately in some medical contexts, but this particular model, there have been reports." I stared at her. "Your daughter was watching the screen when you were on the ground," Petra said. "She wasn't watching you." I want to be honest about the next few hours because I think people imagine that moments like this arrive with clarity. that you hear something and the puzzle pieces fall together and you know exactly what to do. That is not how it happened for me. What happened was that I sat on a log in Lynn Canyon with a stranger holding my watch, and I felt something I hadn't expected, not anger, not fear, grief. The same grief I'd felt when Sandra died, but stranger, because Sandra was gone and I had known she would go, eventually, even if not so soon. But Renee was my daughter. I had held her when she was hours old. I had driven her to piano lessons and argued with her about curfews and stood in the rain at her university convocation. You are not prepared to grieve a person who is still standing 20 meters down the trail, calling for an ambulance. Petra sat with me until the ambulance arrived. She gave the paramedics her contact information and told them what she'd observed. She gave me her phone number and said I should call her when I was ready. Renee rode in the ambulance with me. She held my hand. I let her. The lab results came back 6 days later. The supplement contained a compound, not illegal in trace amounts but present here in quantities that could, over time, cause cognitive impairment, fatigue, and in people with certain cardiac sensitivities, arrhythmia. The diffuser had contained a similar substance. The watch was more complicated. Petra had been right about the transdermal mechanism. The model had been modified. It was not the version Renee claimed to have ordered from a Canadian retailer. The serial number traced to a gray market supplier. The modification was not something available to ordinary consumers. Dwight had a client who imported medical devices. The RCMP found the connection within 3 weeks of me filing a report. I will not pretend the months that followed were simple. They were not. My son-in-law was charged under the criminal code, criminal negligence causing bodily harm, among other things. Renee was interviewed extensively. The question of her involvement, how much she knew, when she knew it, whether she had been a participant or had been manipulated herself, took the better part of a year to sort out. I do not know, even now, exactly where the line is. I think Renee knew something was wrong. I think she told herself a story about it that let her keep doing what she was doing. People are very good at that. I spent 31 years studying human behavior, and I still don't fully understand how someone who loves a person can also, slowly, allow that person to be harmed. But I've come to believe that greed and love are not mutually exclusive. They coexist in people all the time, pulling in different directions, and sometimes greed wins, not through malice, but through incremental accommodation. One small compromise after another, until the accumulation is monstrous. Dwight was convicted. He is serving time. Renee was not charged. I don't know what to do with that, most days. We don't speak. I think, someday, we might. I think I might need that eventually, but not yet. What I want to say to anyone watching this who is over 60 and lives alone and has adult children who are paying close attention to your finances, you're allowed to be suspicious. You're allowed to ask questions. You're allowed to call your own financial advisor without telling your children first, to see your own doctor alone, to refuse supplements or devices or anything else that comes into your home from a source you cannot verify. 63 is not old. I want to say that plainly. I was a professor. I am still sharp enough to recognize a manipulated serial number and to call a lab and to read a report. The fog was manufactured. The confusion was not mine. I live in the same house I shared with Sandra. I still have the coffee mug that was mine. I still go to the bakery on Granville Island for the butter tarts. Last spring, you and I took a trip to the Okanagan, and I drove the whole way, and we talked about economics and his son's cooking and the particular quality of light over the lake in the evening. Petra comes to dinner sometimes. She brings her dog. I make pasta, and she brings wine, and we sit at the kitchen table until late, talking about everything and nothing. I found my way back to myself. It took longer than it should have, and I am still, some mornings, angry about the time it cost me. But I found it. There's something I keep coming back to, even now. Not the watch, not the lab results, not the courtroom. What I keep coming back to is the parking lot at the grocery store, sitting in my car for 10 minutes, unable to remember if I'd already been inside. That man sitting there confused in his own neighborhood, in his own life. That was me. And I had let it happen slowly enough that I hadn't noticed it happening at all. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since then, not in a fatalistic way. I'm an economist by training. I believe in traceable chains of consequence. And what I can trace, looking back, is this. Every time I deferred to Renee's recommendations, to Dwight's questions, to the idea that my confusion was simply grief and age, I handed someone else a little more authority over my own life. It wasn't dramatic. It was a series of small surrenders. And small surrenders, accumulated, become something you can't easily undo. What pulled me back wasn't luck. It was Hugh showing up at my door on a Wednesday without calling first, and me being honest enough with him to let him look at the bottle. Honesty with someone you trust, that's not a small thing. That's the thing. I had been so focused on protecting Renee's feelings, on not wanting to seem suspicious of my own daughter, that I had stopped being honest about what was actually happening to me. When I finally let Hugh see what I was seeing, everything changed within weeks. I think about Petra often, a retired pharmacist on a hiking trail with her dog who noticed something that didn't look right and said so to a stranger, knowing it might go badly. That takes a particular kind of character, the kind that doesn't look away when something is wrong just because getting involved is inconvenient. She had no reason to help me. She did it anyway. I hope I would do the same for someone else. I try to keep that standard in mind. And I think about what it took to walk into a different doctor's office and say, plainly, I think I have been harmed. There's a version of me that doesn't do that, that tells himself he's being paranoid, that his daughter loves him, that there's surely an innocent explanation. That version of me keeps getting foggier and signs documents he shouldn't sign and ends up somewhere he can't come back from. The version of me that made it through was the one that stayed stubborn enough to trust what he was observing, even when everything around him was arranged to make him doubt it. 63 is not the beginning of the end. I want to be clear about that. It is, if anything, the point at which you have enough experience to recognize when something is wrong, if you're paying attention and if you refuse to be talked out of your own perception. The fog that settled over me was not mine. It was manufactured. And the moment I stopped accepting it as a natural consequence of age and grief was the moment I began to find my way back. Hugh and I drove to the Okanagan last spring. The light over the lake in the evening was exactly as good as he'd always said it was.